Welcome to The Blitz, a podcast from 𝗕𝗹𝗶𝘁𝘁. The Blitz is all about tackling tough topics head-on at full speed. Are you ready? Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good whatever time of the day you happen to be listening to this podcast. My name is John Needham. I am lead pastor at 𝗕𝗹𝗶𝘁𝘁, and I'll be your host today on The Blitz. This episode, as you probably already saw, is called Pastors in Politics. And there's a question mark there, like pastors in politics. What in the world is going on? And so here's what I'm kind of anticipating in that title, that some of you, maybe more, maybe less, but at least some of you are wondering, why are our pastors, or why is the pastor at your church, why is he talking about politics more than he used to? So there's a little bit of assumption there on my part, and I think it may prove to be generally true that if you had kind of listened and surveyed sermons from 2 years ago, that a lot of pastors really weren't talking about politics all that much. But in the last year or year and a half, say in this COVID season, pastors have been talking about politics more, and I can clearly observe that just by looking at social media, seeing the posts that are going on, the conversations that are taking place. A lot of pastors are talking about politics more than they have in the past. I know that's true for me. I know that's true for 𝗕𝗹𝗶𝘁𝘁. I know that's true at other churches, and I would actually ask the question, why aren't more pastors talking about politics? But I'm not focusing on that issue in this episode. I want to answer the question, why is it that pastors would talk about politics? Why is that happening more now? So in order to do that, I'm going to kind of give you a little bit of a word picture to deal with, and then we'll look at, just consider briefly some scripture. So first of all, I want you to imagine this, okay? I want you to imagine that you have a car, and that car has a car alarm on it. Now, I know lots of car alarms, sometimes that are hokey, and they go off at the wrong time, or they don't go off, or whatever. So just for the sake of argument, just assume we have a legitimate car alarm on a car. And your car is parked at the Costco parking lot. You've gone to Costco. Maybe it's date night and you're getting the cheap hot dogs, which give you bad burps for hours to come, but they're cheap, so you go there anyways. Or maybe you are, I don't know, maybe you're shopping, whatever. For whatever reason, you find yourself at Costco. When you park at Costco and another car parks right next to you, your car alarm is not going to go off. At least it's not supposed to go off. And when somebody walks with their cart by your car, as they are traveling and finding their way to their parking space, your car alarm is not going to go off. If somebody is parked right next to you and they open the trunk to their vehicle and they start loading their vehicle with groceries, your car alarm is not going to go off. As long as people stay in their lanes and don't cross boundaries, the car alarm doesn't have to go off. However, once a boundary is transgressed, once somebody is no longer dealing with their car, but somebody begins to deal with your car, then your car alarm is supposed to go off, okay? If you can understand that just kind of basic principle, I think that'll help you understand why it is that pastors are going to be talking more about politics now. And the reason for that is when the government overreaches in terms of its authority, when it crosses boundaries, alarms have to go off. It has to be identified. It has to be called out. It has to be spoken of. When the government stays in its lane, when it stays in the boundary that and within its own sphere of influence, then it's fine. We don't have to talk about it. But once that boundary is crossed, once the barrier is broken, the alarm goes off. Right, the car alarm goes off, and pastors also have to talk about this. You have to understand that the state or the government is not sovereign over everything. That is statism, and that is not what we are currently at least supposed to be living under, and that's not what God has designed government for. We've talked about this in other episodes. It is very, very clear that God ordains government, that God establishes authority. There is no authority except for that which God establishes, and that the government has a sword. That's the symbol of their rule. They are to encourage good, and they are to punish evil. That is their God-given role. God is sovereign over all spheres. He's sovereign over all authorities. He's sovereign over the government and has delegated that authority to the government. Okay. Now, the sign of the government and the rule that God has given to government is the sword. You'll know that God also has the church, which is governed by elders, and to the church has been given the keys. So the role of the church and the role of the government is not the same thing. And whenever the government encroaches that boundary, once they get out of their lane, once they start breaking barriers, what you should see is pastors calling that out, and pastors having to talk about that, whether that be in sermons, whether that be in classes, whether that be in podcasts like this. Pastors are going to be talking about it. Why? Because the boundary has been broken, and a lane has been crossed, and so the alarm is triggered. It goes off. We have clearly seen that in our own state. I'm here in Washington State, and our governor in November, as many of you know, forbid singing in churches. He has no right to do that, and so when he crosses that boundary, then pastors need to speak, and they need to be forthright and clear about that boundary being transgressed. So the alarm should be going off when the boundary's being broken. That's why pastors, we have been at least speaking about politics more, and pastors need to be speaking about politics more. Now, I want you to know today is Wednesday. As I'm recording this, it's Wednesday, the 7th of April, 2021. And this morning, as I kind of just checked out what was going on in the world, I saw the video of the church in Canada where 𝗕𝗹𝗶𝘁𝘁 serves as pastor. 𝗕𝗹𝗶𝘁𝘁 was put in prison for preaching the gospel. He was then released, and I think all charges except for one were dropped. And then Canada so graciously responded by putting a fence around his church and effectively prohibiting anybody to attend that church. And essentially, they seized the property. So you just need to know this is fascism. This is totalitarianism. This is a grievous overreach of government. So this is what's running in the background for me as I'm giving this podcast, that government is exceeding, it's reaching past its God-given lane and sphere of influence and authority, is breaking that barrier. And so churches, pastors need to be speaking up. Okay, so why are pastors speaking up? For the same reason the alarm is going off on the car. A boundary or a barrier has been crossed, and it needs to be spoken of. Now, what I want you to understand is that this is not something that should be surprising. It's not something that's new. Right now, our church, 𝗕𝗹𝗶𝘁𝘁 Church, we're going through the book of Acts, and one of the things that we have tried to point out as it surfaces in the text, and it comes up multiple times, especially in the first couple chapters, is that the opposition that the church faced was from magistrates. When Peter and John get thrown in prison, they're thrown in prison for preaching the gospel. And I want you to think about this. The people who were opposing the church, yes, they were Jewish elite leaders, but they had the authority to throw Peter and John in prison. These are the same authorities that had basically had the authority to try and arrest and try Jesus and find him guilty, and then hand him over to Pilate, because what they wanted was capital. They wanted capital punishment. They wanted to be executed. That was not something that was entrusted to the Jewish leaders, but they were able to have that done. And so you need to understand that the opposition in the early church was a political opposition. It was the powers. It was the magistrates. That's who was threatening them. That was who was throwing them into prison. Okay. And the other thing that I would just offer to you, the book of Revelation can be really confusing and certainly requires deep thought and study and investigation. But one of the things that is really, really clear is that the opposition that the church faces in the world is political. It has to do with earthly power and authority. We read in Revelation 13 about this beast. There's a first beast and a second beast, and whether that was something that has already happened in history, whether that was something that actually took place in the lifetime of the readers of this letter from John, which I tend to think it did, or if that's something that's happening in the future. I think there's a pattern. There's a cycle that is repeated, something that what is modeled in Revelation just tends to repeat itself over and over again. So whether you think it's past or it's future, the reality is that the attack that the church receives, the oppression that the church endures in Revelation, it is political in nature. There is a global opposition to the church, and there is authority. There is earthly authority, that is government, that is exercised to make the church suffer, and there's a unified global economic reality to this suffering as well. So without getting into all the symbols and all the numbers and all the dates and all of that, just at a 30,000 feet reading of the text, it's very, very clear that there is an orchestrated global government resistance to the church. That is there in the text, and certainly there are demonic spiritual realities behind that, but those dark forces are being played out through government. So in the book of Acts, it is the magistrates that are oppressing the church and are threatening the church. In Revelation, it is also earthly authorities conspiring together against the church. Why am I saying that? I'm saying that because we need to realize, I think many of us need to wake up to the fact that the forces that push back against the kingdom of God in this world are not these individualized pockets of power, although that does happen, but there are also orchestrated and magisterial attacks against the church. What I mean by that is that there are governments and times in which government moves against the church, to repress the church, to limit the church, to try and squeeze the church out. And one of the reasons for that, right, that's not just a coincidental thing, but one of the reasons for that is because once you have a godless, meaning an understanding of the world that doesn't begin with, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. Once you have a worldview that isn't built on the assumption of the existence of God, right? Once you have that worldview, what you open the door to is totalitarianism. If God is not ultimate, then the only thing that can be ultimate in this world is people and authority and government. And so when that happens, there's no room for the church, because the church has a very contrary message, a gospel to proclaim and to bring, and that is that Christ is Lord, and he's Lord over everything. Everything. It was Abraham Kuyper who famously said, there isn't, essentially, this is a paraphrase, there isn't a square inch in the existence of the world over which Christ does not cry or shout out, mine. Okay? So that antithesis, that tension, that conflict between the church and statism is necessary because of what statism is, because of what godlessness produces in terms of ideology and government. It is an inescapable reality. So if your pastor is talking about politics more and more, understand it's because the boundaries are being transgressed, boundaries are being broken, and when that happens, the alarm has to be sounded. So that's what's going on. I hope that makes sense. I hope that you understand that reality, understand that this is not new. This goes all the way back to Acts in the early church, and it continues to go on today. And so one of the things that we need to be doing is we need to be praying as we see governments increasingly boldly opposing the church. We need to be praying, because what needs to take place is not something that can be taken, that can't be accomplished by flesh and blood, but it's something that the Spirit has to do. There has to be a softening of hearts. There has to be a changing of minds, and the church has to stand up and be faithful and appeal to our God and trust that He hears our cries, just as when Israel was subjected to slavery in Egypt, God was faithful to hear their cries. And so in this time, we need to be crying out to our God, trusting that He will hear and He has the power to rescue. All right, that's all I got for this episode of The Blitz. Hope you enjoyed it. Look forward to being with you next time. Until then, take care.